Emma stood in front of the mirror, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the strap of her dress. It was a simple, elegant piece, but tonight, it felt like armor. She had been single for almost 2 years now, ever since that painful breakup. It had shattered her belief in love, leaving her with scars she wasn't sure would ever heal. But tonight she was willing to try again. Just one date, she reminded herself. Just one date. She glanced at her phone. John. His name was the only thing that appeared on her screen. He seemed perfect. A little too perfect, maybe. The way he texted, his compliments, his understanding of the things she liked. There was something almost familiar about him, something that made her feel like she already knew him. With a final deep breath, Emma left her apartment, pushing the unsettling thoughts to the back of her mind. The taxi ride to the restaurant was short, the streets outside the car window blurred by the constant rain. As she arrived, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of foreboding. The restaurant looked almost out of place, as if it had been there forever, untouched by time. The sign was old, rusted at the edges. The words faded as though they hadn't been painted in years. What kind of place is this? She wondered as she stepped inside. The restaurant was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and damp earth. It felt like stepping into another era, one where time didn't move as it should. The walls were adorned with strange vintage photographs of people who looked both familiar and unfamiliar. Their eyes seemed to follow Emma as she walked past, sending a shiver down her spine. The waitress who greeted her was unnervingly quiet, her face expressionless as she led Emma to a small corner table. And there he was, John. He stood up when she arrived, his smile warm and genuine. But there was something in his eyes, something distant, as if he was looking right through her. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice smooth, too smooth. Emma felt a flutter in her chest, but also a creeping unease. "Am I just being paranoid?" she asked herself. "It's just a date." They sat down, and the awkwardness of first dates filled the air, though it didn't last long. John was charming, easy to talk to, and Emma found herself relaxing into the conversation. But as they talked, she began to notice something off. John seemed to know too much, not just about her interests, but about her past, her childhood, her fears, even details she'd never shared with anyone before. It made her nervous, but she brushed it off, thinking it was just coincidence. Maybe he's just observant, she thought. But the more they spoke, the more Emma felt as though she was being watched, not just by John, but by something else. The room felt colder, the flickering lights above them casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. She glanced around. There were other diners, but their faces were blank, staring ahead without speaking, as though they were part of the background, not real people. Emma's throat tightened. This is strange, she thought. This doesn't feel right. Is everything okay? John asked, his voice soft, almost too soft. His smile was unchanged, but there was a tension in his eyes now. Something was different. Yeah, I think so, Emma replied, but her voice didn't sound like her own. She tried to push the unease away, but it lingered like a shadow at the edge of her vision. The waiter came by to refill their glasses, but Emma's eyes followed him as he moved. He was unnaturally still, his movements stiff, mechanical even. He didn't meet her gaze once. It was as though he wasn't really there, just a part of the place itself. She blinked, and when she looked again, he was gone. Emma's heart began to race. "John, do you ever feel like something's not quite right here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, He looked at her with that same strange, unreadable smile. "This place has a way of making people feel that way," he said cryptically. "But you're safe here." Emma's chest tightened. Safe? Was she? The walls felt like they were closing in on her, the air thicker with every breath. Was this all just her imagination? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the unease only grew. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the time. It was much later than she thought. She had lost track of hours, or had they been here longer than she realized? The clock on the wall above them read 10:30, but when she checked her phone, it said 9:15. She glanced up, feeling a sudden chill. The flickering lights dimmed again, and for a brief moment, Emma swore she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. A man, tall and shadowed, his face obscured by darkness. When she looked again, he was gone. Her pulse quickened. Was she seeing things? Or was something really wrong? "John, I think I should go," Emma said, her voice shaky now. She stood up, suddenly desperate to leave. But as she moved toward the door, she froze. The door was locked. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her breath caught in her throat. "John?" she said, turning around. But when she looked at him, his smile had faded. His eyes were cold, lifeless, like someone who had stopped living a long time ago. "You can't leave," he said softly, his voice not sounding like it came from him at all. There was something wrong in his tone. The air felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on her. What was happening? She turned toward the door again, but the room around her seemed to shift. The walls were no longer familiar. The time on the clock was different now, the moments slipping between seconds like sand through an hourglass. "John, what's going on?" she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. But John only stared at her, his smile now twisted, his eyes darkening with something she couldn't quite name. "You belong here now, Emma," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "We've all been waiting for you." Emma's heart slammed against her ribcage as she backed away from the table, her legs trembling beneath her. What was he talking about? She tugged at the door handle again, but the metal was cold, unyielding, as if the door itself had been fused shut. The air felt thick, suffocating. She spun around, her eyes wild as she searched the room for an escape, but every inch of the space seemed to close in on her. The walls seemed to stretch, bend, as though the restaurant was no longer the place she had entered only an hour ago. John was still sitting there, his smile now a grotesque mockery of kindness. His eyes followed her every movement, unblinking. His calmness only made the panic inside her grow. "Why can't I leave?" Emma cried, her voice breaking. She couldn't understand what was happening, what he was. Was he part of this nightmare? Was she losing her mind? John didn't respond. Instead, he simply stared at her, like he knew something she didn't, like he knew everything. A soft rustling sound from behind her made Emma whirl around. The other diners were now standing perfectly still, their eyes fixed on her, like statues, their faces emotionless, lifeless. There were more of them now, too many to count, their bodies unmoving in the shadowed corners of the room. It was like they had appeared out of nowhere, silently observing her every move. But it wasn't just their silence that unnerved Emma. It was the way they were positioned, as though they had been waiting for something or someone. Waiting for me. Emma stumbled back, her breath shallow and quick. She needed to escape. She had to get out of there. But as she turned to the door again, her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, her hands gripping the cold wooden surface of the table. She wasn't sure how long she had been sitting there, shaking, when she heard a voice. It wasn't John's. It came from the back of the room, from the direction of the kitchen. A voice so soft, so faint, that Emma wasn't sure if it was real at all. But it was there, echoing in her mind. You can't escape. Not yet. The words sent a jolt of fear through her. She stood up quickly, her head spinning. What was that? Who said that? The kitchen door was cracked open, a faint light spilling out. Emma felt an irrational pull towards it, an instinctive need to see what was on the other side, to understand what was happening. She didn't know why she was drawn to it, but she was. It was like the voice was beckoning her, guiding her. She slowly approached, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. It creaked open with an eerie groan, revealing a dark hallway that stretched far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The air in the hallway was colder than anything she had felt before, and her breath puffed in front of her in white, freezing clouds. Emma. John's voice echoed from behind her, his tone more serious now, almost warning. You don't want to go down there. But she couldn't stop herself. There was something in that hallway, something that needed to be seen, understood. She stepped forward, her feet dragging against the cold floor as if it were pulling her in. The lights flickered once again, the hum of the restaurant buzzing in her ears. She could still hear John's voice, but it was drowned out by the unsettling quiet of the hallway. The floor beneath her feet seemed to groan with every step she took, and the temperature dropped even further, turning her breath into mist. As she moved down the narrow corridor, a feeling of dread washed over her. There were photographs hanging on the walls, old sepia-toned pictures of families, couples, and strangers who looked as though they had stepped out of another time. Their eyes followed her, their faces frozen in moments of silent agony. She didn't want to look at them, but she couldn't turn away. Suddenly she stopped in her tracks. A photograph in particular caught her attention. It was an old black and white photo of a woman who looked strikingly familiar. It was her. The woman in the picture had the same eyes, the same features, but her face was locked in a look of terror, as if she were trapped in some kind of unseen nightmare. Emma's blood ran cold. What is this? She whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. At the edge of the photo, there was a date, 1937. Her head spun as she stumbled backward, the air in the hallway now thick with a strange pressure, like the walls themselves were closing in on her. She turned around to leave, but the hallway stretched on infinitely, no end in sight. The door she had come through was gone. There was only darkness in front of her. A shadow moved across the far wall. Emma gasped, her heart racing. The figure was tall, looming in the dark. It moved closer, step by slow step, until it was standing right in front of her. She could feel its presence, the coldness of it seeping into her bones. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The figure was tall, dressed in a long tattered coat that swayed as it moved. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Emma could feel its eyes upon her. Cold, lifeless eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, its cold hand reaching out for her. Emma stumbled backward, her heart thundering in her chest. She could see its hand now, pale and lifeless, almost decayed, as if it had been dead for years. "Help me," she screamed, but the words felt hollow, as though they had no power. The figure didn't stop. It kept coming, closer and closer, until she could feel the coldness of its presence pressing against her skin. And then, in a blur of motion, the figure was gone. The hallway fell silent again. Emma looked around, breathing heavily, her body shaking. She was alone again. But the terror remained thick in the air. What was happening to her? Was this real? She turned to run, but the hallway seemed to twist and bend, stretching impossibly long. The walls closed in, the pictures of the past now watching her, their eyes pleading, accusing. Escape was impossible. And then, just as suddenly, the hallway opened up into another room, a small, dimly lit space that looked familiar. It was the restaurant, but it wasn't. The tables were empty now, the chairs overturned, and the walls were peeling with age. The photos were gone. And standing in the center of the room was the same man she had seen in the photograph. She stared at him, unable to speak, frozen in place. He smiled at her, a smile that was too wide, too knowing. "You can never leave," he said. His voice echoed through the empty room, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. "This place? This is your home now." The floor beneath her feet trembled, and she realized with a sickening lurch that she was no longer standing. She was sinking, being swallowed by the darkness, just as the faces in the photos had been. And as the last of the light flickered out, Emma finally understood. She had become part of the restaurant, part of its twisted, endless cycle. She was never leaving. The darkness swallowed Emma whole, and for a brief moment, she felt weightless, as if time itself had stopped. But that feeling faded quickly, replaced by an overwhelming pressure that pushed against her chest. She gasped for air, but it felt as though there was none to be found. The cold suffocating her was no longer just physical. She could feel it creeping into her bones, into her very soul. When her vision finally cleared, she found herself back in the restaurant. But it was different now. The atmosphere was heavier, as though the walls had grown older, the decay deeper. The flickering lights above her buzzed louder, their uneven hum vibrating through her entire body. The other diners, those strange, lifeless figures, were seated at their tables, their eyes fixed on nothing, their bodies rigid in place like mannequins in a forgotten store. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized that they were no longer just watching her. They were waiting. She tried to move, but her body felt like it was made of lead. Her legs refused to obey, as if they were frozen in place. "Why can't I move?" Panic surged through her veins. She turned her head wildly, looking for any escape, but every door she tried to reach was locked. No matter where she turned, no matter how many steps she took, the exit remained out of reach. The room seemed to stretch and shift with each frantic glance she threw, its edges warping as though reality itself was beginning to break apart. And then she heard the voice, low, soft, but undeniable. "You're not the first," it whispered, and Emma spun around to find the source. The voice was coming from the man who had been in the photograph, the man whose eyes had haunted her every step. He was standing near the back of the room now, his pale face barely illuminated by the dim light. His features were sharp, his eyes deep, hollow pits that seemed to swallow all light. There was no warmth in them, only cold, empty darkness. "You're part of the cycle now," he continued, his voice sending chills through Emma's body. "This place, it traps people, over and over. It consumes them, and it never lets them go. You're just another name on the list." Emma shook her head in disbelief, her heart pounding in her chest. What is happening? Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning in a dizzying spiral. This couldn't be real. She had to be dreaming. She had to be imagining this. But then the man took a step forward, and Emma's body froze. There was no escaping him. no avoiding the truth that was slowly creeping into her consciousness. She was trapped. "You were always meant to be here," he said, his voice laced with something cold, something ancient. "Just like the others before you. You think you're different, that you're special, but you're not. You're just another soul, destined to wander this place for eternity." Emma tried to scream, to run, but her voice failed her. The weight of his words hung in the air like a suffocating fog, smothering her hope, drowning her in despair. She could feel the walls pressing in around her, her surroundings closing tighter and tighter until she was consumed by the shadows. She turned desperately to John, her only thread of familiarity in this nightmare. But when she looked at him, he wasn't the same. His eyes, once soft and inviting, were now cold and devoid of life, like the others. The smile he had once flashed at her, charming, comforting, was now twisted into something unrecognizable. A hollow, soulless grin that sent a wave of revulsion through her. "You don't belong here," she whispered, barely able to breathe as she took a hesitant step back. "This isn't real. This isn't what I signed up for." John's lips parted slightly, and the words that escaped his mouth were slow, deliberate, and far too calm for Emma's liking. "That's the thing, Emma," he said softly, his voice no longer the soothing tone she had once heard. "You didn't sign up for this. It wasn't your choice. You were always meant to be a part of this place. You think you can escape, but you can't. None of us can." Emma's stomach twisted in knots. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This was not a bad date. It wasn't a nightmare she would wake from. She was trapped, and so was everyone else. She had been brought here for a reason, just like the others who had come before her. And now she was a part of this place. A part of the endless cycle that kept people locked in a loop of hopelessness and despair. The voices of the others began to rise, soft murmurs at first, then growing louder. They whispered her name, calling out from the corners of the room. The faces in the photographs on the walls, those eerie, lifeless faces, seemed to shift and change. They were all the same, their eyes fixed on her, their expressions pleading, begging her to understand. "You can't leave," the man's voice echoed, repeating over and over in her mind. "Not until you've joined them. Not until you've become a part of this place." Emma's chest tightened as the walls seemed to close in, the air becoming suffocating. Her heart raced, her mind fighting against the crushing weight of the truth that was beginning to take root. She had become one of them, a part of this restaurant, a part of the twisted cycle, and she could never escape. A chill ran through her, freezing her to the spot. She was no longer herself. She had become another shadow, another face that would watch the next soul wander through these doors, thinking they could escape. And she would wait, like the others, until the next victim came. Her eyes glazed over as she looked out across the room, at the other diners who were frozen in time, their eyes now dull and empty, just like hers. They were all the same now, trapped, lost, waiting for the cycle to begin again. The room fell silent, save for the soft hum of the lights above. And then, as if it had always been this way, everything faded to black. Emma's name echoed in the darkness, and the cycle began anew. The blackness consumed her entirely. For what felt like an eternity, Emma existed in a void. No light, no sound, just an endless silence pressing against her. She had no sense of time, no awareness of where she was or who she was. She simply was. And yet, in that strange, infinite blackness, something began to change. A faint, distant sound reached her ears. It was the soft clinking of silverware, the quiet murmur of voices, familiar sounds, the sounds of the restaurant, the very place she had thought she had left behind. But this time, the sounds felt different, muffled, as if they were coming from far away, as if she were listening to them from the other side of a thick wall. And then, with no warning, the darkness shattered like glass. Emma's eyes snapped open, her heart racing as she gasped for breath. She was back in the restaurant. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't the cold, decaying place she had been trapped in moments ago. This version was brighter, cleaner. The walls were newly painted, the photographs on the walls pristine and perfectly aligned. There was no dust, no sign of the decay that had once plagued the room. She blinked, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. Had she somehow woken up from a dream? She could still feel the weight of the terror she had experienced, the crushing despair, but the restaurant in front of her seemed normal. The strange, unsettling atmosphere was gone, replaced by a sense of eerie calm. The tables were set with pristine tablecloths, candles flickering gently on each one, casting soft shadows on the floor. The diners were present, but they were different this time. They looked like regular people, laughing, talking, enjoying their meals. None of them seemed aware of her presence, and none of them looked at her the way the figures from before had. Emma stood frozen for a moment, her mind spinning. Was this a new layer of the nightmare? Was it a different version of the restaurant? A voice, familiar yet distant, broke through her thoughts. Emma! She turned, her breath catching in her throat. It was John. But he wasn't the same either. His eyes were warm again, his smile genuine. There was no hint of the cold, hollow man she had seen earlier. He looked real, like the John she had met at the beginning of the night. John? Emma's voice cracked, unsure of whether she was truly awake or still trapped in the nightmare. He stepped toward her, his gaze soft and reassuring. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice gentle. His tone was completely different from before. There was no malice, no darkness in his words. Just the kindness she had once felt from him. But even as she looked at him, a nagging suspicion tugged at the back of Emma's mind. Something was off. It was too perfect, too normal. Was this real? Or was this just another layer of the trap? Before she could voice her doubts, John took her hand, guiding her to one of the tables. She could feel the warmth of his touch, but the unease in her chest wouldn't go away. It felt like she was being pulled into something she didn't fully understand. As they sat, the waiter appeared, offering a menu. Emma's eyes scanned the items, but they all seemed, wrong. The food didn't look right. It was too pristine, too perfect, as if it had been manufactured, not prepared. And when the waiter smiled at her, she noticed something unsettling. His eyes, though wide with an artificial cheer, were not entirely human. They were hollow, too wide, too empty. The air in the room shifted again. The laughter, the talking, it all began to sound far away, like it was happening underwater. The lights above flickered briefly, casting long shadows across the walls. The room felt colder, the edges of the space beginning to darken once more. "Emma." John's voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "Do you feel it? You feel it, don't you?" Her pulse quickened. She nodded, her hand tightening around the glass in front of her. She couldn't explain it, but something had changed again. This wasn't the restaurant she had entered earlier. It wasn't even the same place she had been trapped in before. The atmosphere had shifted, subtly, imperceptibly. Suddenly, the lights above them flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had been here before. The darkness, the weight, the suffocating pressure that threatened to swallow her whole. And then, the voice came again. The same low whisper that had echoed through her mind earlier. You can't escape. Not yet. Emma stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't breathe. But no. This wasn't happening again. The walls of the restaurant began to stretch, the space growing larger and larger, the air growing thicker. Her vision blurred, and she reached for John, desperate for some anchor, some reassurance. But he was no longer standing next to her. Instead, there was another figure. A man, tall and shadowed, standing in the center of the room. He didn't have a face, just a blank, smooth surface where his features should have been. Who are you? Emma's voice trembled as she took a step back. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing directly at her. The motion was slow, deliberate, and Emma felt a coldness wash over her. The ground beneath her feet began to crack, the floor splitting apart, revealing a deep, dark abyss. The walls distorted, bending at impossible angles. The diners, those once normal figures, now stared at her with blank, unblinking eyes, their faces contorted in silent screams. She wanted to run, but the ground beneath her feet was crumbling, and the air was thick with the same suffocating pressure as before. "John!" she screamed. "Help me!" But he was gone. All that remained was the man without a face, the figure in the center of the room, watching her, his blank gaze piercing her very soul. The darkness was closing in again, the walls collapsing around her. She could feel herself falling, but there was no escape, no way out. The room stretched infinitely, its boundaries impossible to find. The whispers of the other souls surrounded her, their voices growing louder and louder, the sound deafening. And then, in a sudden, cruel twist, everything went black again. This time Emma knew. She understood now. There was no waking up. There was no escape. She had become part of the cycle, forever trapped in the restaurant, just like the others before her. There was only darkness. Only the endless waiting, the endless cycle. And she would wait too. For the next soul to wander in, hoping for something real. For the next person to believe they could escape. But they wouldn't. None of them would. The cycle would never end, and neither would she.